Step away from the vehicle, now. You don't get to question my authority.
I'm complying. But you're detaining me without cause. That's a mistake.
You don't tell me how this works.
Security cameras captured the exact moment a routine traffic stop turned into a career-ending mistake. The footage shows a city police officer standing on the side of a quiet residential street, his posture stiff, his voice suddenly uncertain. Just seconds earlier, he had been confident, in control, certain he was dealing with just another driver who needed to be put in his place. It all began at 2:47 p.m. on a calm weekday afternoon. No sirens, no chaos. Just flashing lights behind a black sedan moving through a neighborhood where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The officer approached with authority, hand resting near his weapon, already convinced he knew who this man was and why he did not belong there. What he did not know was that every word, every command, every decision was being recorded. And more importantly, he did not know who he was actually standing in front of. When a simple piece of identification finally came into view, everything changed. The air shifted. The officer's confidence drained from his face. In that moment, he realized this was no ordinary stop. He had just pulled over a U.S. Marshal. And with that single decision, his career was already over. The man behind the wheel of that black sedan was named Gary Williams. At least that was the name on his driver's license. To the world around him, he looked like any other middle-aged man heading home after a long day. Simple jacket, no uniform, no markings on the car, nothing that suggested power or authority. And that was exactly how he preferred it. Gary had spent more than 15 years as a U.S. Marshal. Before that, he served in local law enforcement, learning the job from the ground up. He had tracked fugitives across state lines, stood in courtrooms guarding judges under threat, and walked into situations most people would spend their lives trying to avoid. Yet off-duty, he lived quietly. No flashing badges, no special treatment. Just a man who believed the law applied to everyone, including himself. That afternoon, he wasn't on an operation. He wasn't transporting a prisoner. He wasn't carrying out an arrest. He was driving home through a neighborhood he had passed through dozens of times before. He obeyed the speed limit. He signaled his turns. He did everything by the book, the same way he had taught young officers to do during training sessions. The officer who pulled him over was named Leonard Shaw. Shaw had been with the city police department for 8 years. He wore his badge like armor and carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he had seen it all. To him, authority was something you asserted first and explained later. He had written hundreds of traffic tickets, made countless stops, and rarely had his judgment questioned. Shaw noticed the black sedan almost immediately. Something about it caught his attention. Not the speed, not a broken taillight, not an illegal turn, just a feeling. A sense that the driver didn't quite fit the picture in his head of who belonged on that street. That feeling was enough for him. He followed the car for several blocks, watching closely, waiting for even the smallest mistake. When he finally activated his lights, he already believed he was in control of the situation. In his mind, this was just another stop. Another chance to remind someone who held the power. Gary noticed the lights and felt that familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear exactly, more like caution. Years in law enforcement had taught him to recognize when a stop felt routine and when it felt wrong. Still, he did what he always did. He pulled over safely. He turned off the engine. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, clearly visible. When Shaw approached the car, his posture was rigid. His hand hovered close to his weapon. His voice was firm, but there was an edge to it. He didn't start by asking for license and registration. Instead, he asked a question that told Gary everything he needed to know. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Gary answered calmly. He explained he was heading home. He kept his voice even, respectful, professional. He had no intention of escalating the situation. Experience had taught him that ego was dangerous on both sides of a badge. At no point did Gary mention his federal status. Not yet. He believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. He believed that most situations could be resolved peacefully if both sides followed procedure. He assumed Shaw would do just that. Shaw, however, had already made up his mind. He saw compliance as something to be demanded, not earned. He interpreted calmness as defiance. And in that moment, he failed to recognize the quiet confidence of a man who knew the law better than most people wearing a uniform. Before we continue, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe. Stories like this only make sense when you see how they unfold. Because what happened next was not just a misunderstanding, it was the beginning of a chain reaction. One driven by assumptions, one fueled by unchecked authority, and one that would soon expose the difference between wearing a badge and truly understanding what it means to uphold the law. The moment Leonard Shaw finished asking that question, the tone of the stop shifted. This was no longer about traffic. It was about control. Gary could hear it in the officer's voice, feel it in the way Shaw stood just a little too close to the door, angled in a way that suggested he was prepared for something that wasn't happening. Gary answered calmly. He said he lived nearby. He said he was heading home. His hands never moved from the steering wheel. His voice stayed even. He knew how quickly a situation like this could spiral, and he had no intention of giving Shaw any excuse. Shaw did not seem satisfied. He leaned in slightly, peering into the car, as if searching for confirmation of a suspicion he could not name out loud. He asked for license and registration, but the request came late almost as an afterthought. Gary told him where his wallet was and asked for permission to reach for it. Shaw hesitated. That hesitation mattered. It was subtle, but it revealed distrust. Finally, he told Gary to go ahead, but his hand moved closer to his weapon as Gary slowly retrieved his license. Everything about Gary's movements was deliberate. Slow, visible, controlled. Shaw studied the license longer than necessary. He didn't comment on the name. He didn't mention any violation. Instead, he asked another question that had nothing to do with driving. Do you have anything in the vehicle I should know about? Gary answered honestly. He said there were no illegal items. He did not volunteer more than was required. He had learned long ago that extra words could be twisted into justification. Shaw's jaw tightened. The answer didn't give him what he wanted. At 2:49 p.m., Shaw made his first clear mistake. He told Gary to step out of the vehicle. Gary paused just for a moment. He asked why. The question was calm, professional, and reasonable. Shaw responded by repeating the order louder this time. He did not explain. He did not articulate probable cause. He simply expected compliance. Gary opened the door and stepped out. He closed it behind him. He stood facing the officer, hands visible, posture relaxed. Anyone watching would have seen a man doing exactly what he was told. Anyone listening would have heard no resistance, no attitude, no threat. Shaw began asking more questions. Where was Gary coming from? Where exactly did he live? How long had he been in the area? Each question pushed further away from any legitimate purpose. Gary answered without argument, though his instincts were now fully engaged. He knew this pattern. He had seen it from the other side of the badge. An officer fishing for something that would justify what had already been decided. At 2:51 p.m., Gary did something important. He told Shaw that he was a federal law enforcement officer and that his credentials were inside the vehicle. He said this calmly, without raising his voice, without posturing. He offered to show them. Shaw did not react the way he should have. Training dictates that when someone credibly claims to be a federal agent, the situation changes immediately. Protocol requires verification, coordination, and de-escalation. Shaw did none of that. Instead, he dismissed the statement. He told Gary to keep his hands where he could see them. He said anyone could claim to be law enforcement. His tone was sharper now, defensive, almost irritated. Gary tried again. He said his badge and credentials were in his jacket on the passenger seat. He asked for permission to retrieve them. Shaw refused. At that moment, the stop crossed a line. Gary was being detained without cause, denied the opportunity to identify himself properly, and treated as a suspect based on nothing more than assumption. A woman across the street slowed her walk. A man watering his lawn stopped and watched. Nothing dramatic was happening, but something felt wrong. The tension was visible even from a distance. Shaw ordered Gary to move to the rear of the vehicle. Gary complied. He stood where instructed, hands still visible, body angled slightly away from the officer to avoid appearing confrontational. He continued to speak in a measured tone, explaining that this situation could be resolved quickly if Shaw simply allowed him to retrieve his identification. Shaw responded by raising his voice. He told Gary he was not in charge. He said he would decide how the stop proceeded. The words were sharp, defensive, and unnecessary. At 2:54 p.m., Shaw called for backup. The call he made did not match reality. He reported a non-compliant individual claiming to be law enforcement. That statement would later become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence against him. Anyone who watched the body camera footage could see that Gary had been nothing but compliant. 2 more officers arrived within minutes. Officer Glenn Foster and Officer Rachel Nguyen stepped out of their cruiser and immediately sensed the tension. They took in the scene quickly. Gary standing calmly, Shaw visibly agitated, a small group of onlookers nearby. Nguyen asked Shaw what was going on. He gave a short defensive explanation, claimed the driver was being evasive, claimed there were safety concerns. Nguyen looked at Gary and asked him directly what had happened. Gary explained again calmly that he was a U.S. Marshal and that his credentials were inside the vehicle. He stated his full name. He stated his agency. He asked once more to retrieve his identification. Nguyen looked at Shaw. That looks at everything. She suggested they verify the claim. Shaw refused. He insisted on maintaining control. He said he wasn't comfortable. This refusal isolated him. Foster shifted his weight uncomfortably. He was newer, less confident, but even he could see the problem forming. This was no longer just a traffic stop. This was a test of judgment. At 2:58 p.m., Shaw announced he was going to search the vehicle. Gary immediately stated that he did not consent. His voice remained steady but firmer now. He explained that without probable cause or consent, a search would be unlawful. He said this not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. Shaw ignored him. He moved toward the passenger side and opened the door. The body camera captured everything. The neighbors' phones captured everything. Shaw reached into the jacket on the seat and pulled out a leather credential holder. When he opened it, time seemed to slow. The gold badge, the federal seal, the photo, the name, all of it was unmistakable. Shaw froze. The confidence drained from his face. His shoulders dropped slightly. He stared at the credentials longer than necessary, as if hoping they might change into something else. Something less devastating. Nguyen stepped forward and looked for herself. She didn't hesitate. She took out her radio and asked dispatch to verify the badge number. 30 seconds later, the confirmation came back clear. Active U.S. Marshal, in good standing. The street was silent. The neighbors watched. Foster looked down. Shaw said nothing. The power dynamic had reversed completely and everyone could feel it. But the damage was already done. You have just watched how a series of small decisions driven by assumption and unchecked authority can spiral into something irreversible. Have you ever seen a situation escalate like this when it never needed to type yes? If you have. Before we go any further, take a moment and think about what you just witnessed. A routine traffic stop. No speeding, no threat, no crime in progress. And yet in less than 10 minutes, it had turned into a situation that would trigger a federal investigation and destroy a man's career. Have you ever seen something like this happen in real life? Maybe to a friend, maybe to a family member, maybe even to yourself. If you have, type yes in the comments. These stories aren't rare. They're just rarely documented this clearly. If you're finding this story intense, make sure you're subscribed. What comes next is where everything changes. The paperwork, the investigations, the legal consequences that don't show up on body camera footage but follow people for the rest of their lives. Take a breath. Because the moment that badge came out was only the beginning. The real reckoning was still ahead. The moment the badge was confirmed, the street no longer belonged to Leonard Shaw. It didn't belong to him at all anymore. Authority had quietly slipped out of his hands, and there was nothing he could do to get it back. Dispatch's voice crackled through the radio, calm and professional. The badge number checked out. The name matched. Active U.S. Marshal. Federal credentials verified. There was no confusion, no ambiguity, no room left for denial. Shaw handed the credentials back without meeting Gary's eyes. His movements were stiff, now mechanical. The same hands that had hovered near his weapon minutes earlier suddenly looked unsure of where to rest. He muttered something that sounded like an instruction to stand by, but the words carried no weight anymore. Officer Nguyen took control immediately. Her voice was steady, authoritative, and deliberate. She told Shaw to step back. She apologized directly to Gary, not in a dramatic way, but with the quiet seriousness of someone who understood exactly how serious this situation had become. Gary said very little. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lecture. He didn't gloat. He simply stood there composed, watching the aftermath unfold. Years of experience had taught him that the most important part of situations like this came after the stop ended. Shaw attempted to recover. He cleared his throat. He said there must have been a misunderstanding. He suggested that protocols were confusing. But the body camera didn't care about explanations. The neighbors' videos didn't care about intent. Facts were facts, and every second of the encounter had been preserved. Gary asked for Shaw's name and badge number. Shaw hesitated. That hesitation was captured too. Officers are trained to provide that information without delay. Shaw eventually complied, his voice quieter than before. At 3:06 p.m., Gary was told he was free to go. He didn't leave immediately. Instead, he calmly documented everything. Times, names, badge numbers, patrol car identifiers. He took photographs of the scene. He saved the footage to secure cloud storage before he even drove away. This was not his first encounter with misconduct, but it was the first time it had escalated this far. By that evening, a formal complaint had been filed with the U.S. Marshal Service and the City Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. The report was detailed, precise, supported by multiple video sources. There was no emotional language, just facts. Within 48 hours, Shaw was placed on administrative leave. The department released a brief statement acknowledging an ongoing investigation. The statement used neutral language, but behind closed doors, panic had already set in. Federal involvement changed everything. This was no longer an internal matter that could be quietly managed. Investigators reviewed Shaw's body camera footage frame by frame. They listened to the dispatch call where he misrepresented Gary as non-compliant. They compared his account with the footage and found discrepancies, serious ones. Then they looked deeper. Shaw's personnel file told a story the department had ignored for years. 12 prior complaints, most involving traffic stops, most involving drivers of color, most dismissed or resolved with minimal action. No pattern had been officially acknowledged. Until now. The Department of Justice opened a civil rights investigation. Local media got hold of the story within days. Headlines spread quickly. A city cop illegally detains a U.S. Marshal during a routine traffic stop. Body camera footage confirms misconduct. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Shaw's face appeared on screens across the country. His name became associated with bias, abuse of authority, and professional failure. Friends stopped answering his calls. The police union issued a carefully worded statement distancing itself from his actions. 3 weeks after the incident, Shaw was officially terminated. The reasons were listed plainly: unlawful detention, failure to follow protocol, filing false statements, conduct unbecoming an officer. There was no appeal process that could save him this time. But termination was only the beginning. Gary filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. The claim outlined unlawful detention, illegal search, and violation of constitutional protections under color of law. The damages sought were substantial, $5 million. During discovery, more evidence surfaced. Witness statements, prior complaints, internal emails showing supervisors had been aware of Shaw's behavior but chose not to act. The case was airtight. Facing overwhelming evidence and mounting public pressure, the city chose to settle. The agreement included a multi-million-dollar payout to Gary, mandatory departmental reforms, and independent oversight for future complaints. Taxpayers would foot the bill, but the message was unmistakable. One traffic stop had triggered consequences that reached far beyond a single street. And Leonard Shaw would never wear a badge again. The fallout didn't end when Leonard Shaw turned in his badge. In many ways, that was only the beginning. The uniform had been his identity for nearly a decade. Without it, he was just another man facing the consequences of choices he could no longer undo. His termination became permanent public record. Any attempt to work in law enforcement, private security, or government service was blocked immediately. Background checks flagged his name. Interviews ended early. Doors closed before he could even explain. Friends from the department stopped reaching out. Some out of fear. Others out of quiet agreement that what he had done could not be defended. At home, the pressure was relentless. News clips replayed the footage again and again. Neighbors recognized him. His family felt the weight of stares they never asked for. His children heard whispers at school. His marriage, already strained by the stress of the investigation, didn't survive the aftermath. Authority had once protected him. Now it offered nothing. The city tried to move on, but the damage lingered. Taxpayers questioned how an officer with so many complaints had remained on the street. Supervisors were called to testify. Policies were rewritten. Training manuals were updated. Quiet demotions followed. Accountability, long delayed, finally arrived. Gary Williams returned to work the very next week. There was no victory lap, no press tour, no demand for attention. He went back to doing what he had always done: protecting judges, transporting prisoners, enforcing the law with the same discipline he had shown during that traffic stop. The settlement money didn't change him. A large portion went to legal funds supporting victims of unlawful detention. Another portion was donated to community programs focused on legal education and civil rights awareness. Gary understood something most people didn't. Justice wasn't about punishment alone. It was about preventing the next abuse of power. Within the U.S. Marshal Service, the incident became a case study. Training sessions used the footage to show how quickly authority can collapse when it's built on assumption instead of law. Younger officers listened closely. Some uncomfortable, some grateful. All paying attention. The street where it happened returned to normal. Cars passed, lawns were mowed, life went on. But the lesson stayed. A badge is not permission. A uniform is not immunity. An authority without restraint is only a liability waiting to be exposed. Leonard Shaw believed he was in control that afternoon. He believed the man in the car had none. He was wrong on both counts. If this could happen to a federal agent who knew the law inside and out, what does that say about how ordinary people are treated every day? That question is the real ending of this story.